Welcome to video 16. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. Collectivist ideologies are full of good intentions. The following is a quote from C.S. Lewis. Quote, "Of all tyrannies, a tyranny exercised for the good of its victims may be the most oppressive. It may be better to live under robber barons than under omnipotent moral busybodies. The robber baron's cruelty may sometimes sleep, but those who torment us for our own good will torment us without end, for they do so with the approval of their own conscience." Someone said the road to hell is paved with good intention. This applies so perfectly to the collectivist worldviews represented by the political ideologies of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Their ideas were put into practice in the 20th century in the form of communism and socialism. They are still around, alive and well. Now, what were the historical conditions which gave birth to these ideas? Let's go back to the end of the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution created a situation that completely disrupted the agricultural-based society of the time. The advances in technology and the ability to mass produce created a whole new class of people, the factory worker. Cities began to grow at an unprecedented pace. As always, science and technology got way ahead of social and political progress. People became an expendable commodity. The allure of moving to the city and leaving the grueling and harsh rural life was very tempting. This created a situation in which there was an almost endless supply of cheap labor. As we said before, human nature is very powerful. The self-interest tendency took over. The people with the means to invest in production took advantage of the fact that there were no rules, no safety concerns, no limit to the amount of work hours in a day. Children could be put to work. The conditions were literally not much different than slavery. When you understand the historical moment in which they wrote the Communist Manifesto, first published in February 21st, 1848, you can see the motivation behind it. If you stay on the surface of their ideas and the shallowness of their thinking process, it all sounds wonderful. I have read the manifesto, all of it, roughly 45 pages. It almost seems incredible that a work of such small stature, that is so superficial, has had such an influence in the real world. It contains no in-depth analysis, no account for individual human nature, ingenuity, tendencies, aspirations, desires, and psychology. Has no reasoned study of political economy or any other social or societal organization. In fact, it is so puny as a scholarly work that I will attempt to summarize it in a sentence. It goes like this. Two classes exist in our present social order. This was in the 1840s, 50s. The bourgeoisie, which is a fancy French name for the upper class, and the proletariat, the working class. The former, the bourgeoisie, controls and abuses the latter, and at some point the proletariat will violently rebel against the oppressors, take over, distribute the wealth around, and we will all live happily ever after. That's it. If this description of such a seemingly important work sounds outrageous to you, I urge you to read the manifesto yourself. Do it with an open and objective mind. Now, do it with the historical perspective and hindsight you have today, which have been provided by the 20th century experiences. Everywhere these so-called theories have been put into practice, The results have been death and destruction. That is historical fact. How was this possible? How could these atrocities take place? How could figures like Mao, Mussolini, Stalin, Castro, and Hitler ascend to absolute power? There are many other small examples and forgotten throughout all the world. Look at what's happening now in Venezuela. That's the latest example of it. Now, amazingly, this was predicted in 1840 by a guy named Alexis de Tocqueville. He wrote in his famous work, Democracy in America, Volume 2. Now, the complete work includes 2 volumes and about 900 pages of in-depth, thoughtful, extremely objective, and brilliant analysis of the then 51-year-old and unique political experiment called the United States of America. He goes through a detailed and minute description and study of all the different characteristics of the federal system, the Constitution, the separation of powers, etc. He adds to his work the advantage of seeing America from a European point of view. He was French, which affords him total objectivity and the ability to compare America and France, and the important differences between the American Revolution and the French Revolution. I highly recommend reading this guy. Here is a brief summary, but unlike the manifesto, it cannot be done in a sentence. In his first volume, he concentrates on the political structure, the Republican/Democratic institutions. In the second volume, which he wrote 5 years later, he concentrates on the effects that democratic institutions and equality have upon civil society and the actual day-to-day lives of the people that live under this political system. This is, in his own words, the central theme of his work. Quote, I perceived that the equality of conditions is the fundamental fact from which all others seem to be derived, and the central point at which all my observations constantly terminated. His lifespan was from 1805 to 1858. This falls right in the midst of the most important and transformational periods in human history, the aftermaths of both the American and the French revolutions. The transition from aristocracy-based to equality-based societies. Nowhere in the world was this more evident than in America, which is what prompted him to come here, travel all over the United States, observe, study, analyze. Joseph Epstein expresses this in his introduction to Democracy in America. He says, where others were confused by the jumble of life about them, he, de Tocqueville, was fascinated by it. Where they saw chaos, he perceived patterns. No phenomenon, be it a certain kind of personality, the common thread of tying together a group, or the odd character of an institution, could pass before him without his working his way to a determination of its underlying cause, reason for being, ultimate significance. His was an intelligence organized for almost perpetual intellectual penetration. End of quote. The historical shift was the gradual demise of the power of the European aristocracies based on birth and class rigidity, and the spread of the notions of equality of men under democratic institutions of government. Although he was an advocate and friend of equality, he also warned us against the dangers of the rule of the majority through the influence of public opinion and the propensity equality can have to turn into despotism. This is what we were talking about in other videos about the founders not wanting this to become a democracy, the mob rule. This is his warning. It almost sounds counterintuitive, but let's go back into the history of the aristocratic system. It was based on a rigid caste structure, which did not allow for social mobility. But, and this is the interesting part, it allowed the decentralization of power. Now, how was that possible? As I explained in a previous video, one of the most successful and longest lasting forms of government has been the oligarchy. And that's what an aristocracy society is. At the head, you have the king, and below, you have a whole structure of somewhat independent secondary powers. This is what de Tocqueville calls them. Those powers were exercised by the nobility, a very well established class, meticulously structured over many generations. The effect of this was a natural and unplanned system of checks and balances. This occurred naturally. For the lower classes, this meant a very small and very local circle of power directly affecting their lives. Everybody knew his or her station in life, and nothing could change that. The power that ruled them was very concrete, palpable, and physically present in their lives. It was the Lord in the castle. Now, switch to a state of total equality, where each individual station in life can change in either direction, up or down, where birthrights do not count, where every individual is endowed by their Creator with equal rights under the law, and is afforded the liberty to plot his or her own course in life. As an aside, I would remind you, and I talked about this in a previous video, I am very much aware of the darkness that the institution of slavery had, and it was still very much alive when the United States was formed. But we need to put this moment in history aside. So, what are the consequences of this state of society, this new state of society, upon the everyday lives of the citizen? Now, de Tocqueville put this in this way, quote, "The principle of equality, which makes men independent of each other, gives them a habit and a taste for the following in their private actions. No other guide but their own will, and speedily suggests to them the notion and the love of political freedom." The other side of the coin, he continues, and this is the warning against collectivism, quote, "As the conditions of men become equal among a people, individuals seem of less importance, and society of greater dimensions. Or rather, every citizen, being assimilated to all the rest, is lost in the crowd. This naturally gives the men of democratic periods a lofty opinion of the privileges of society and a very humble notion of the rights of individuals. They are willing to acknowledge that the power which represents the community has far more information and wisdom than any of the members of that community, and that it is the duty as well as the right of that power to guide as well as govern each private citizen. This explains, way before they happened, the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, the People's Republic of China, and countless other examples throughout the 20th and 21st century.